January 14, 1978. Winterland Ballroom, San Francisco. 5,000 people packed into the hall. Punks, misfits, curious onlookers who'd heard about the most dangerous band in the world. The Sex Pistols walked on stage for what no one in that room knew would be the very last time. Sid Vicious could barely stand. Johnny Rotten stood at the microphone looking out at the crowd like a man staring into a fire he'd decided to let burn. Somewhere behind the scenes, their manager Malcolm McLaren was watching, as he always was, with the eyes of a man running an experiment. And when it was all over, Rotten said 4 words that became one of the most famous sentences in rock history. But to understand what happened that night, you have to understand the 12 days that led to it. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I tell the stories behind the music, the real ones, the ones the official version leaves out. The Sex Pistols had been the most combustible force in music since rock and roll was born. In 1977, they released Nevermind the Bollocks, an album that sounded like a fire alarm going off in a library. It frightened the British establishment so deeply that the BBC banned their singles. Shops refused to stock the record, and the band members were routinely arrested just for existing. None of that stopped anyone from buying it. By January 1978, they were the most talked about band on the planet. And Malcolm McLaren, their manager, strategist, and provocateur-in-chief, decided it was time to bring them to America. Not to New York, not to Los Angeles, not to the cities where music journalists lived and the sympathetic audiences waited. He booked the Deep South. McLaren's thinking was ruthless and deliberate. He wanted confrontation. He wanted culture shock. He wanted footage. And he made sure the press was watching every step. Warner Brothers reportedly had to put up $1 million bond just to secure the band's 2-week visas. The U.S. government wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for Johnny Rotten and company. The tour started in Atlanta on January 3rd, then Memphis, then San Antonio's Randy's Rodeo, a venue where 1,200 people showed up, and the mix of punk fans, curious locals, and metalheads was exactly as volatile as it sounds. Sid Vicious screamed a homophobic slur at the crowd that night. He hit someone with his bass. The show barely held together. Then Baton Rouge. Then Dallas. Dallas was the masterpiece of McLaren's chaos strategy. He booked them into the Longhorn Ballroom, a country and western venue, the kind of place where Hank Williams posters hung on the walls, and the regulars wore boots and belt buckles. Sid Vicious walked out and told the crowd they were a fucking bunch of cowboys. They obliged. Somewhere during the set, by most accounts during holidays in the sun, Sid got knocked clean to the floor. He finished the rest of the show with a broken nose, blood on his shirt, still playing, or attempting to play. Lydon and Steve Jones watched from their corners of the stage, visibly delighted. Because here's what you need to understand about Sid Vicious by this point in January 1978. He was not a functioning musician. He was the image of punk, the sneer, the chains, the self-destruction. But he was hopelessly, terminally addicted to heroin. He nodded off on stage. He played notes that had nothing to do with the song. He was a caricature of everything the band had been built to represent, spiraling toward an ending that nobody wanted to look at directly. And Rotten knew it. He was barely speaking to his bandmates. He'd seen where this was going. He'd been living inside the Sex Pistols machine long enough to understand that the machine had eaten itself. McLaren wasn't managing a band anymore. He was managing a spectacle. And so they arrived in San Francisco. The Winterland Ballroom, January 14, 1978. 5,000 people. The show was raw and ragged and somehow still electrifying, because even a half-destroyed Sex Pistols was still something people would remember for the rest of their lives. They tore through their set. The crowd was everything McLaren could have wanted. Loud, volatile, completely alive. And then came the encore. Rotten stepped to the mic before the final song. He said, "You'll get one number and one number only, 'cause I'm a lazy bastard." They played No Fun, a cover of the old Stooges song, the Iggy Pop original that had been rattling around rock and roll for a decade. But Rotten wasn't singing the Stooges version anymore. He was singing something new. "This is no fun, no fun. This is no fun at all, no fun." The song ended. The noise died. And Johnny Rotten stood at the edge of the stage, looked out at 5,000 faces, and said the 4 words he'd apparently been building toward for months, maybe years. "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?" He threw the microphone down. He walked off. He never performed with the Sex Pistols again. 4 days later, on January 18th, he formally announced the breakup. The band that had lasted 30 months, from formation to disintegration, was over. They wouldn't play together again until 1996, when they reunited for the tour they called Filthy Lucre, a name that at least had the honesty to describe what it was. But what Rotten said that night in San Francisco was directed at everyone in that room, and maybe at himself, maybe at McLaren, maybe at the whole idea that punk rock, a movement built on authenticity, on refusing to play the game, had somehow become the game anyway. The Sex Pistols didn't burn out. They didn't fade away. They were detonated, and Malcolm McLaren held the fuse. Some managers build careers. McLaren built a demolition. And the rubble of those 12 days in America shaped what rock and roll would sound like for the next decade. 4 words. That was the ending. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? If you want to go deeper, click on the video on your screen right now. Another story is waiting, and I think you're going to want to hear it.